part 4 of chapter 6, we'll take a brief look at how different metabolic pathways can feed into cellular respiration. This shows a lot of interconnecting metabolic pathways here. We obviously don't need to know the details, but if we look along this red line that's coming straight down the middle here, that's glycolysis. So we started off with simple sugars, we ran glycolysis, and then we also send some of those over here into the citric acid cycle and oxidative phosphorylation. So that's the cellular respiration that we've looked at. This also looks at a lot of other pathways, other things that we can break down, that we can send through the different stages. We can send through glycolysis or cellular respiration. Or if we have excess, what if we don't need to break down sugar? What if we have excess sugar? Then what do we do with it? So this just kind of looks at a whole bunch of different metabolic pathways. Let's take a look at a more simplified view of that and ask about other types of molecules that we can burn for energy. You remember we had the different classes of biological molecules. We talked about carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. And so we can use carbohydrates other than just glucose to do cellular respiration. We could use a disaccharide like sucrose, so we would just pop it in half and then we would send one of those 6 carbon sugars through and then we would send another 6 carbon sugar through. We also could do a similar thing with starch. So a polysaccharide is just a whole long chain of sugars. So if you have a polysaccharide like starch being stored, you just essentially take that and just start popping those sugars off and running it through cellular respiration. You also can burn fats. And so we'll see how we can burn fats through this process. And we can also sometimes burn proteins for energy. So the cell can use any of these types of molecules to make ATP. This looks at the different ways that these molecules come into this whole process. So the one that we've looked at so far, we looked at sugars going through glycolysis and then all the way through to oxidative phosphorylation, generating our ATP. If I have a bigger carbohydrate, I just have to break it into the simple sugars and I can still run that. So the only thing is we would add a step in front of this if it was a disaccharide or a polysaccharide and say, okay, before we do this, we have to break that down into its simple sugars. What about over here with fats? Remember what a fat is. It's a 3-carbon backbone called glycerol. And then that glycerol has fatty acids attached to it. Remember the triglycerides. So we had glycerol, and then we had these 3 fatty acid chains. The first thing we're going to do is to separate those. So we're going to pull the 3 fatty acid chains and glycerol apart. That glycerol can then come in here, and it will become one of the intermediates. We didn't look at all the stages of glycolysis, but it'll go in sort of the middle of glycolysis here. Now, the fatty acid chains are really just long hydrocarbon chains. They were just a whole bunch of carbon and hydrogen. So what we will do with those is we will break them into little 2-carbon groups. So we're going to take this long chain and we're going to pop off 2 carbons. And remember, that's what this acetyl-CoA here is. It's a 2-carbon compound that we send into the citric acid cycle. So we just pop off these little 2-carbon pieces and we run it through this way and all the way through oxidative phosphorylation. And usually those long fatty acid chains are very long. So gram for gram, you can get a lot of energy out of fats because you have very long fatty acid chains. It's one reason why our body uses fats to store energy. What about proteins? Well, remember, a protein is a long chain of amino acids. So the first thing we're going to do, just like we've done before, is we're going to pop those individual units apart. So we're going to break the protein down into individual amino acids, like a chain of beads. We're going to pull the beads apart. Now, part of that amino acid was an amino group. And that we're going to strip off right away, and we've got to get rid of that because this can form ammonia and becomes toxic in the body. So we have to pull that amino group off and send it over to get rid of it. Now, what we do with the rest of it depends on which amino acid it is, because remember, we have 20 different types of amino acids, and they're all going to have a little bit of different structure. Depending on which amino acid it is, some of them will come back here and might be converted into pyruvate and go through part of glycolysis. Some of them might be converted to acetyl-CoA and go through here. Some of them might actually enter into one of the molecules that's part of the citric acid cycle. So they can come in here a variety of different ways. So the amount of energy that we would get from them depends on where they enter. So it's going to be highly variable how much energy we get when we burn protein versus fatty acids because they enter at different places. But we still can use those. If we don't have carbohydrates, we can switch to using other molecules. For instance, if you started on a low carbohydrate diet, what you're trying to do there is to get your body to switch over to burning some of these fats. And one of the things you want to make sure that you do if you are doing a low carb diet is you want to make sure you have your protein intake high enough, because what you don't want is your body to leave its fats alone and start burning proteins for energy, because then you would lose muscle mass. So you want to make sure your protein intake is fairly high when you're doing that, when you have your low carb intake, so that you're forcing your body over here to burn some of these fats. Animals store most of their energy reserves as fats. If you have excess energy, you don't typically store it as a polysaccharide. You store a little bit as polysaccharide in your muscle cells as glycogen, but you don't store a lot that way. Most of the energy that we have, if we have excess energy in our body, we're going to store it as fat. And one of the reasons for that is that if we just look at the overall chemical equation, think of what a polysaccharide is. It's a whole bunch of sugars put together. What is one sugar? It's C6H12O6. Hydrogen doesn't weigh a whole lot. Carbon is sort of in the middle. Oxygen weighs a lot. So for a molecule of sugar, the biggest part of the weight of the sugar is the oxygen. The triglycerides, the fats, they have these long hydrocarbon chains, and that's what we're going to use for the energy. And all you have there is carbon and hydrogen. In essence, you've got a lot of energy there, not taking up a whole lot of weight, because you don't have any oxygen added to that. So it's all carbon and all hydrogen. So gram for gram, you have a lot more energy you can pack into lipids than you can into polysaccharides. So our bodies store it in that way. Now, another thing that we do is we can take some of these molecules and use them to make new molecules for what we would refer to as biosynthesis. What if I need to make an amino acid? What if I need to make a particular molecule? Just like we saw before that we could break things down, we can create them. I can take molecules off of the citric acid cycle, I can take this acetyl-CoA, and I could build fatty acids. So if I need to build up tissues, I can go in reverse. If I need energy, I can break tissues down and get energy. If I have enough energy and I need to build tissues, I can do some of this in reverse. We've talked before about feedback inhibition. Remember what that was? You had a long metabolic pathway, and the product at the end of the pathway, so we thought about it like a conveyor belt. You have a conveyor belt and you're making something, and you don't want to make too much of it because that's not really efficient in a cell. So it starts to build up in the cell, and then this product that's coming off of the conveyor belt goes back around and turns off the conveyor belt. It turns off the enzyme that's running that conveyor belt. And that's what we see, all of these enzymes that are running these different reactions. Many of these will be regulated by this feedback inhibition. So we don't get too much buildup of ATP. We don't get too much excess of any of these molecules in the cells. One of the questions they pose in the textbook is explain how someone could gain weight and store fat even if they're on a low-fat diet. So if you're not taking in a lot of fat, why would your body create fatty tissue? Well, what's going to happen, again, we can go back and look at one of these previous diagrams. What's going to happen if you're not taking in fat, but you are taking in, let's say, excess carbohydrates? Well, your body doesn't store a lot of carbohydrate because it's not really efficient to do that. So what it will do if it has excess carbohydrates that it doesn't need for energy, so you're consuming carbohydrates but you're not really spending a lot of energy, it's going to take the extra that you're consuming and it will convert it into fat, because that is a more efficient way for your body to store that excess. So you can take a very low fat diet and still gain quite a bit of weight because of this excess of the carbohydrates. And that's usually when you have blood work done, they'll talk about a high triglyceride level. Triglycerides are these fats, but a lot of times the reason why you have a high triglyceride level is in many cases more because you're taking in too much carbs. Now, you could be taking in too many fats too, but for many of us, it's because we're taking in too many carbs. Just make sure you go through the review questions at the end for Chapter 6.
There are some things in life that when they're around, we wish they weren't there, and when they're gone, we're just glad they left. For many of us, one of those things is fat. But your fat tissue is full of important biological molecules called lipids, long, stringy compounds of hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen that are great at storing energy in their chemical bonds. When the molecules are broken apart, they release the energy stored in their bonds. We often refer to this process as burning fat. But when you burn fat, where does that material, the actual stuff that jiggles around and cushions you and insulates you, where does it go? Interestingly enough, a recent survey of doctors, dietitians, and physical trainers revealed that even the experts in fat loss didn't know the answer, although they thought they did. More than 50% of the respondents thought that when you burn fat, all that mass is simply converted into energy and lost as heat. It's a common misconception, but it's not possible. I mean, just because you don't like something doesn't mean that the laws of chemistry don't apply to it, and one of the basic principles of chemistry is the conservation of mass. This just means that the same amount of material always comes out of a reaction as goes into it. Even if that reaction happens to generate heat, you'll wind up with the same number of each kind of atom that you started with. So when you break up those lipids in your fat cells and release their energy, all of that hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen in those molecules will still be there afterward. But if you burn a lot of fat and it's not there anymore to hold your pants up or whatever, where did the mass go? Turns out, you exhaled it. Biologists at the University of New South Wales recently did an atom-by-atom breakdown of where the mass of your fat goes after it's burned in your body. They found that for every 10 kilograms of fat that you burn, you have to inhale 29 kilograms of oxygen to metabolize or break down the fat and release its energy. And the process of breaking down that much fat produces 28 kilograms of carbon dioxide and 11 kilograms of water. So for every kilo of fat that you burn in your body, more than 80% of that mass is lost as carbon dioxide that you breathe out. The other 20% you lose as water, and your urine, your sweat, or depending on how hard you work out, your tears. But if you do the math, you'll see that all the mass in that fat-burning reaction has been conserved. 10 kilos of fat plus 29 kilos of oxygen equals 39 kilos total, and together they produce 28 kilos of CO2 plus 11 of water, which also equals 39 kilos. So remember that the next time you're huffing and sweating on a treadmill or walking your dog or really doing anything that makes your body call on its energy reserves. You're basically just emanating fat through your breath and your skin, but in a good way.